Okay, so Russell on knowledge by acquaintance and knowledge by description. And what I'd like to keep trying to do today and then in the next session before we just review and wrap up is try and say where I think we are now. We're thinking about how to look at these questions about reference and mode of presentation and so on scientifically. So let's start out by doing the kind of bread and butter on the way Russell is thinking of this contrast between knowledge by descriptions and knowledge by acquaintance. And then backtrack a bit, because Russell is giving a lot of weight to consciousness or awareness of objects in his account of how we're able to refer to them. And it's not quite obvious that that perspective is consistent with cognitive science or where it would fit into a cognitive science approach to human knowledge. And it's often said that consciousness is just a kind of arresting epiphenomenon, a beautiful decoration on the surface of some parts of the universe, very puzzling, but it doesn't actually do any work, just ornamental. And that's really not how Russell is thinking about it, and that's not how I think we commonsensically think about it. And then finally, I'll just start in on the contrast between imaginative and objective ways of thinking of other human beings. It's come to seem to me that this is really central to thinking about many of these topics. So I'll try and touch on that today, and I'll amp it up a bit when I get back. Okay, so knowledge by description. You have knowledge by description of an individual when you say something like, well, there must be someone in this room who is the tallest or the heaviest. Who could that be? What must they be like? So the tallest person in this room, I guess, is over 4 feet tall, over 5 feet tall. Yeah. I bet you they have brownish hair. Yeah. What do you think? Be spectacled? You can figure out things about the tallest person in the room just by thinking about it. There's some sense in which you don't know who it is, right? Is it, I mean, for example, you can conjecture, is the tallest person in the room also going to be the heaviest? But you're just doing it kind of top down, a priori. Or if you're an astronomer thinking about the center of mass of the solar system, I guess there is such a point, the center of mass of the solar system. I have no idea where it is. Would it be inside the sun? Inside the Earth? Somewhere out in space? Probably the sun. Yeah, right. So it's probably inside the sun. So there you go. You got knowledge by description of the center of mass of the solar system. But that's because you figure out a priori there must be such a thing. You're open to challenging that. I mean, maybe there's no tallest person in the room. Maybe it's a dead heat. Maybe the room is completely empty. There might not be any such thing, but you can know that there is such a thing. You can know there's just one such thing, and you can figure out stuff about it. I mean, for example, if I'm thinking the first headache I have in 2015, my bet is the first headache I have in 2015 will be caused by job-related stress. Right? That is, I think, an absolutely safe bet. Yeah. Either that or caused by a New Year's hangover. Right? So you can figure out these things like in advance. Did you actually have the primal encounter with the thing? When you say, lo, my headache, I mean, if you contrast, when you're saying, this headache is unendurable, this headache is throbbing, then what you then have is the primal encounter with the thing itself that is letting you talk about it. It's not merely something hypothesized. Okay, so is that a reasonably clear contrast between the way you can talk about and speculate about the first headache you're going to have in 2015 and the kind of direct encounter you have with a headache right now? So Russell says, I say that I'm acquainted with an object when I have a direct cognitive relation to that object, i.e., when I'm directly aware of the object itself. The word acquaintance is designed to emphasize the relational nature of the fact with which you're concerned. So acquaintance is a relation. Here is the subject, there is the thing. The subject is in this relation of direct acquaintance to the thing. And that's the basis of reference. That's the basis of non-descriptive identification of object, that kind of knowledge by acquaintance of objects. So this is not a type of representation. It's not that you're representing the object. You just stand in this more primitive, non-representational relation to it, and in virtue of having that direct encounter with it, you can now represent it. We shall say that we have acquaintance with anything of which we're directly aware, without the intermediary of any process of inference or any knowledge of truth. Okay? The raw encounter with the actual headache, the present headache. And when we ask, what are the kinds of objects with which we're acquainted? Remember, this is the puzzle we came to earlier with Russell trapped behind a wall of sense data, right? The first and most obvious example is sense data. So all your current sensory experiences you're acquainted with. When I see a color or hear a noise, I have direct acquaintance with a color or noise. And the color or noise here are the particulars, the particular items in your sensory field. But in addition to that awareness of particulars, we also have, they're not in quite the same sense, awareness of universals. We're not just aware of particular yellows, but if you've seen a sufficient number of yellows and have sufficient intelligence, you're aware of the universal yellow. So in Russell's terms, when you've done this is yellow, that's yellow, that's yellow, that's yellow, you've cottoned on to the yellowness, and he's calling that awareness of the universal. So that's that universal is the subject in judgments like yellow differs from blue, or yellow resembles blue less than green does. So when you make these judgments, you're relying on your acquaintance with the universal to interpret the yellow. And that universal yellow is a predicate in judgments like this is yellow, where you get a particular item in your sensory field and you're saying this falls under that universal. And he's very clear that we're not acquainted with physical objects, and we're not acquainted with physical minds. These things are known by knowledge by description. Physical objects are just known as the cause of the table-ish sense data. Other people's minds are known as the cause of these grumpy sense data, or whatever it is. You get onto the other person's mind by conjecturing that such a thing is there. We say we've merely descriptive knowledge of the so-and-so when, although we know that the so-and-so exists, and although we may be acquainted with the object, which is in fact the so-and-so, we do not yet know any proposition. A is the so-and-so, where A is something with which we're acquainted. Okay, so the center of mass of the solar system is a clear example of that. You don't have to have a primal encounter with the center of mass of the solar system. But Russell says physical objects in other people's minds are like that too. Okay, we covered the basic ideas here, God, a couple of months ago. But is that familiar? That's easy enough? Okay, the thing is, this is a very different perspective to the perspective in the mind that you get from current cognitive science. Consider the honeybee. There's quite a lot known about honeybee cognition. Honeybees are actually pretty smart. I mean, they do this dance to indicate to each other where food is. Yes? Honeybees dancing? Okay. There were experiments recently, just a few years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, where they kidnapped honeybees. These are honeybees out foraging, and they trap them, put them in a cardboard box, put them in the trunk of a car, and drive them a couple of miles. Oh, it's switched on. It's switched on. Excuse me.
Or no, right there.
Okay, maybe it's not working. Okay. Well, okay, thanks.
Sure.
Okay. Okay, so you kidnap the honeybee. You put it in the trunk of a car. You drive it a couple of miles out of its way, and then you release it. And what you find is that when the honeybees are released, they kind of fly to and fro a little bit to get their bearings, and then they fly straight home. It is really clear that they've got some kind of map of their surroundings there in those tiny little heads. Yeah, there's a reasonably well-developed map. There's a really striking experiment where the experimenters manipulated the dance of a honeybee so that it was indicating to its fellow honeybees that there was pollen to be found in the middle of a lake, and the other honeybees just ignored it. Right? They figured out he's telling us there's there's pollen in the middle of a lake. That can't be right. Yeah. So the honeybee cognition is probed and reasonably well understood, but are honeybees conscious? Are honeybees conscious? You think so? Yeah. I once went through a period where I talked very regularly to someone who worked, a zoologist who worked just on honeybees, and he was very clear that they weren't conscious on the grounds that they were too small. Nothing that small could be conscious, right? Have awareness of the world. Have feelings. Not be a mere automaton. Well, you can't imagine what it's like in there, right? Because you can't fit. Okay. Well, people experiment quite freely with honeybees. Yeah, you stick pins into them. Houseflies. Could we have a vote in this? How many people think houseflies are conscious? Put your hand up. Okay, so you're certainly not the only one. And if you think they're not?
What about an I don't know?
What about what?
I want to be a false alarm. I don't know.
Oh, yes, and if you don't know, and if you have no idea what I'm talking about, okay, right, that covers the basis. Okay, the thing is that in order to study honeybee cognition, you don't need to make any assumptions at all about whether they're conscious or not, right? You can just say, I really have no idea, that isn't imponderable, but still study how they have knowledge of their surroundings, right? And so far as current cognitive science goes, that's the way humans are studied. Suppose you had Martian psychologists who stand to us somewhat as we stand to honeybees, right? Let's suppose they're very much bigger than us, they are very much smarter than us, but they like to study us. They tell each other, look at these guys on Earth, marvelous little chaps. They run about in these motor cars, fantastic navigational abilities. You should see the kind of things they build. Are they conscious? Well, I don't know. Things as soft and squashy as that couldn't be conscious, could they? Could they? Maybe that's just arbitrary. They have this kind of discussion, right? But they don't need to make any assumptions about whether we're conscious or not in order to study our cognition. And if you think about the way that actual human psychologists study human cognition, it's exactly the same methodology. They have you in a lab looking at a computer screen. They have you navigating around an environment. They're not making any assumptions about consciousness any more than they are with the bee. But Russell is saying, and traditional epistemology says, and actually ordinary common sense says, it's only because we're conscious that we have any knowledge of our surroundings. And the trouble with Russell's way of going at it, that idea of developing the idea that consciousness is what gives us. I mean, how come you have knowledge of what's in front of you right now, but not knowledge of what's right behind your head? Well, anybody would say it's because I'm conscious, right? It's my awareness of what's right in front of me that I have knowledge of it. So it's good to see if we can give any mileage to this idea that consciousness gives us knowledge of the world. But Russell's way of doing it leaves you trapped behind a wall of sense data, trying to figure out what hypothetical people or objects might be causing these sense data, whereas we seem to have much more immediate knowledge of the physical world than that. And G.E. Moore, Russell's friend and contemporary, gave an analysis of visual experiences very like Russell's talk about acquaintance. It's talk really about how we can refer to physical objects at all. It looks like Russell's, but there's an interesting difference. Moore said, when you're considering, say, visual sensations, in every sensation there are two distinct terms. One of them is consciousness. So if I'm conscious of this chair, I'm conscious of that person, then the relation of consciousness is the same in every case. It's like the relation of being 3 feet away from. You can be 3 feet away from practically anything, and it's still the same relation, right? So you can be conscious of the chair or conscious of the person, and it's exactly the same relation. In respect of all sensations, in respect of consciousness, all sensations are alike. You stand in this relation to something. And then there's something else in respect of which one sensation differs from another. And that second term is the object of the sensation. So if you've got a sensation of brown and you've got a sensation of purple, then the relation of consciousness that holds between you and the object is just the same. Yeah. What's different is just the thing that's on the other end of the relationship. And Moore's point is we are as directly aware of the existence of material things in space as we are of our own sensations. That was Moore's refutation of idealism. You are conscious of feelings, conscious of pangs or itches. You're also conscious of other people, physical objects, tables, chairs, and so on. The basis on which you say, I know that I have a yellow sensation, is the same as the basis on which you know that there's a chair there. So your knowledge of physical objects is just as basic as your knowledge of sensations. That was Russell's mistake. So when we were looking at Polition and thinking of Polition's way of explaining how you're acquainted with physical objects, people often do say that's a kind of acquaintance. Polition is clearly thinking of it like that. But this is a picture that doesn't give any role to consciousness at all. This kind of system that Polition has, this kind of set of visual indexes that are causally tied up to the external objects and then input into your reasoning, you might think, well, consciousness is a kind of epiphenomenon. Consciousness is a kind of gas that floats above the whole thing. It's not really a working part of the apparatus. But what Moore is saying and what Russell are saying is, no, consciousness is a working part of the machine. It's because you're conscious of your surroundings that you can have knowledge of them. As Moore puts it, I'm as directly aware of the existence of material things in space as of my own sensations. Now, how can you fit that kind of idea into thinking of our knowledge of our surroundings scientifically? I said the usual way scientists think about human cognition doesn't involve consciousness at all. But it seems to me you can actually interpret what goes on in vision science experiments in terms of consciousness. Okay, watch me very closely here. Here's a classic vision science experiment, right? We've all been there, right? The striking thing about this, it seems to me, vision scientists don't usually put it this way, but if you're thinking in terms of Russell or Moore about what's going on in a vision science experiment, well, here you have the subject, right? Here you have the computer screen. Here you have a bit of the environment. And the subject is given some task to do that's defined in relation to the computer screen. Okay? So what the scientists are doing is they're giving a task that involves a relation between the subject and a bit of the environment. And then they're trying to figure out what is going on in the brain. Yeah, they can do it directly, as with this guy, or the kind of more indirect ways of trying to figure out from their performance on the tasks on the screen what is going on in the brain. But there are two levels here. One is the level of a relation between the person and the environment, and the second is a characteristic of information processing in the brain. So at which level would you expect to find consciousness or reference? Level 1 or level 2? Put your hand up if you think the answer is level 1. If you think the answer is level 2. And if you don't know, and if you have no idea what the question is, anything else? Okay. Answer 2, I think, is the general answer of cognitive science, that people usually take it, that consciousness is something given off by the machinery in here. But what I want to suggest is, if you're thinking of this in Russell or Moore's terms, then the relation of consciousness that lets you refer to things is the relation of seeing. So we should be taking seeing the target, being able therefore to refer to the target, as a primitive thing. I mean, when people are doing analysis of what's going on in the visual brain, they're breaking down the brain into bits. They are saying, here are the components of the functional processing. And then the great puzzle of consciousness is, well, where in all this does consciousness show up? Right? That is a current version of the mind-body problem. But what I'm suggesting is that think of this in terms of acquaintance with the object, with the external object, with the computer screen. And it was just a mistake to be looking for consciousness at this level. Consciousness has to do with the relation between the viewer and the external scene. Now, that's not to say that the vision science is unilluminating. I'll try and bring out in a minute that when you go right back to Frege's stuff and modes of presentation, you can actually use this kind of approach to illuminate what's going on with modes of presentation. Because what you're looking at is a relation between the viewer and the screen that is sustained by the viewer's brain. So if you look at the causal structure of what's going on in the viewer's brain, you can understand better the causal structure in the relation between them and the screen. Okay. I've got a feeling that this oscillates between being too slow and too fast. Yes?
When you're talking about two different levels where you constantly come to consciousness, it's then a bit problematic because it appears to me that one is causally responsible for the other. My relation to the environment is exactly causally responsible for some causal
That's right. The two interact. Yeah. So if you see when you see an apple and you reach for the apple, yeah, that's got to be setting off information processing that will let your arm swing into motion to catch the apple. Yeah, yeah. That's right. I don't. You can. That's right. Yeah, yeah. If you're doing philosophy, you know, there's no particular relation to your environment, right? But you're doing the processing. Yeah. And you can be doing the processing in the absence of consciousness. Yeah. That's what the blindside cases show. I think it seems. I'm really happy to be called out in this if you disagree, right? Because by no means everybody agreed about this, but it seems to me that what I'm suggesting is that we should look for consciousness at the level of seeing the screen. Yeah, and the brains are involved, but the operation of the brain is a mechanism that lets you see the screen. Yeah. But consciousness is not itself a phenomenon inside the head. Yes, good. Yeah.
I don't get it because, like, sort of going off to what you said, like, in order, so, like, I have this much here, and I'm like, okay, I want to reach for this button. I'm
Right.
gonna reach for it,
Right.
So when I reach for it, this is the relation between the person and the environment.
That's right. That's one relation between the person and the environment. Reaching for it, yeah.
The characteristic of information processing and brain is that the first has visual input. So
Yeah.
it's like perception, so then it goes into like my visual cortex, which then shifts into like my occipital lobe,
Right.
which then shifts into your prefrontal cortex and
That's fine. Yes, yes.
so what you're saying is that, but why is it that whatever's the process that's going on in your brain, why is it that that isn't evidence of consciousness?
Oh, that would be evidence of consciousness. You could have that kind of process going on. I mean, a blind-sighted patient could reach for the cup, yeah, without ever having been aware of the cup. Yeah. So in principle, you could have the kind of thing going on that you described without awareness. Yeah. But even when there is awareness, you could give the kind of description that you just gave. Yeah. And that's what's so puzzling about the mind-body problem. People track, from the hits in the retina, back to the visual cortex, all the way through these other areas, out to the arm movement, and at no point did you see consciousness. And people say, wow, that's really weird, it must be very elusive. Yeah. But I'm suggesting it's not elusive at all. You saw the cup. That interacted with those other processes.
So what about, like, for example, like
A
a
ro-
robot?
Well, if the robot does see the cup, then the robot is conscious. Otherwise, it's only got some kind of blind sight. So if it's a conscious robot, then sure. You just tell me about what kind of robot it is, and I'm happy to work with that. If it's not a conscious robot, then it doesn't have consciousness. Yeah.
What about the causation there? I mean, the robot would only understand the object that he or she is looking at, or it is looking at. There's only a customary output. If you trace the causal link back to the program, and not the robot.
Okay. Well, think of this in Wittgensteinian terms. Suppose you cut out people sometimes say, suppose you cut out consciousness from a human. Yeah. What difference would it make? And you might be like a robot, right? You might be like a skillful robot that does everything that a human can do. Vacuums a room as well as a human can do. It kind of drives a car as well as a human can do. Without having consciousness. Yeah? You wouldn't be any worse off if we stripped out the consciousness and left the rest intact. Yeah, that's what people sometimes say. And it seems to me that if you had that, you'd have something that in Wittgensteinian terms had the use of all the signs, could talk maybe like you or me, but you wouldn't have the first idea of what was going on. You wouldn't have any glimmering of what you were about if you didn't have consciousness of the world. If consciousness was eliminated, but you found yourself moving and acting and talking, and then suddenly normal services resumed, and you get conscious experience of all these people, you'd say, now I know what was going on. I'm talking to all these people. Yeah, you see what I mean? I'm picking up that cup. The consciousness is what gives you this insight into what you're doing when you're using words. That's what the robot would be missing. The robot does all that stuff all right. In Wittgenstein's terms, it can go on just fine. But because it doesn't have consciousness, it doesn't have any insight into why it's doing what it's doing.
But I mean, they should also perceive that, like, the physiological structure and mechanism, that's why it's doing it.
That is why it's doing what it's doing, but
Like,
yeah.
pick it up, if that's like the logical structure.
That is the logic of the program. No, that's right. I mean, there are reasons why, there are causes of its doing what it's doing. Yeah. But what I'm saying is our consciousness gives us an insight into why we are doing all that stuff, what we are about, that the robot doesn't have. We'll come back to that. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I can talk the talk, sure.
Then I would go like, no, you
You,
At first the robot wouldn't fit that, but I'd be right.
lie is a strong word. You don't know. I wouldn't want to deny either, actually, that you could equip a robot with some kind of rigmarole it could produce as to say why it was doing what it was doing. Yeah. But what you couldn't do is, but the thing is that consciousness hits a spot for us in a way that it's not hitting a spot in the robot. We don't need that kind of rigmarole to tell us what we're doing. We don't need to do that kind of abstract thing of there is a cup there to which I'm spatio-temporally related, and my arm movements are taking me towards that cup. We don't need that kind of abstract high-level description. I agree you could fit a robot out with it, but consciousness just informs you in this very immediate way what it is that you're acting on in a way that the robot doesn't have that. Come back to that, okay. Yes? Yep. That's very good. Yeah, I agree that we want the consciousness to be playing a causal role, to be playing a working part in the machinery. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, why bother? Yeah. Yeah. Okay, I just want to remark that consistent with this kind of experiment, with giving a lot of weight to this kind of experiment, you can think that consciousness conceived of as a relation between you and the environment can have a role to play in causally explaining what's going on. And it'll be important to be very sensitive to what level of explanation you're at here. But there's a kind of puzzle that goes away if you think about it like this, which is thinking consciousness is when you get some blobs of sensation deep in your brain. Now, where are they and what are they doing? Right, that's the way the problem is usually conceived, and that's when the problem seems completely unsolvable, completely hopeless. Yeah. This is a much more technical thing about juggling with levels of explanation to understand what role the relation is playing in causation here. And that seems to be crackable. One last one here. Yeah. Yes. It certainly doesn't have the same kind of experiences that you or I are having, because our experiences involve relations to the environment, and the brain in the vat is not having that. Yeah. Whether it's completely unconscious, it would need more discussion, but it's certainly not having the kind of visual experiences that you or I are doing, yeah, because these are relations. Yeah. Let me just start on how you might use this kind of approach to start getting at Phrygian senses. Right, the big puzzle about Phrygian senses was they seem to be they seem to be descriptive. I mean, we don't have any way of specifying them except by talking about properties of the objects. So okay. There are properties of the objects outside you, and there are the objects themselves, and the sense of a sign seems to have to do with the properties of the object, not just the object, right? Because you can have different senses associated with the same object. That's where we came in. Yeah. Okay, but consider, I mean, this is not very well presented, but right now, and statistically, quite a lot of you will not be able to see this at all. But this is one of these color blindness tests, right? So this is a gold 5 picked out on a red background. Yes, so the only thing distinguishing the 5 from its background is its color. That's the idea of this kind of test. That okay? And if you can't see it, just take my word for it, right? suppose you think, well, what is the sense of us assigning that 5? When I pick out that 5, I'm doing it by relying on a property of the 5, the color. But does that have to be a description that I can understand? Well, children can see the 5 in this kind of display long before they have any color vocabulary. Color vocabulary is actually surprisingly difficult for children to learn. Darwin actually thought that his children were colorblind because it took them so long to learn color words. You can take a child of 2 that already has hundreds of words in its vocabulary and say, this is red, this is green. You know, you do the Wittgenstein thing. This is red, this is green. You do that 700 or 800 times and the child still doesn't get it. There's even a word in German for it, a special word in German for it, Farbendummheit, color stupidity. You know, it's not actually color. They're not colorblind because they can see the 5 perfectly well, but they can't give names to it, right? They can't articulate it. Now, that means that the child hasn't formulated a description. Yeah, you can be using the color to pull out the object from its background, even though you are not capable of formulating a description. The gold object. Yeah. So when you think about what's going on here, there are 2 different aspects to the way properties work in vision. One is you use the properties of a thing to pull it out from its background and let you see the object in the first place. The other is the thing that Russell talks about with knowledge by description. You're using the color, in this case, you're using the color of the 5 to allow you to be acquainted, to get knowledge by acquaintance of the 5. But you may have no knowledge by description of the 5. It's not that you are thinking of it as the gold object, because these children are able to see the 5, they're acquainted with the 5 perfectly well, but they don't know about colors. I mean, this is very obvious if you think about animals. An animal, a tiger that is out hunting, that is using color to let it detect its prey, it doesn't care about the color of its prey, if you see what I mean. There is a book called Why Cats Paint that shows many, many pictures of cats putting paint across canvases, right? And it's kind of mad because you know that animals have no interest in color for its own sake. All that animals use color for is to pick out objects from, well, pretty much, the basic thing animals use color for is to pick out objects from their backgrounds. But it's not as if the tiger is then going to go on and make judgments about color. This one matches that one I had last week. You see what I mean? It doesn't do that kind of stuff. It just cares about getting onto the object. So the color itself does not figure in any description that the animal has. Yeah? But it's nonetheless defining a mode of presentation, because it's what pulls out the object. If this is a solid display where you could kind of go around the back and explore the 5 tactually, then the tactual thing then would be another thing that lets you pull out the object from the background. It's not doing it descriptively, because you don't have any knowledge using color descriptions here. But the 5 is characterizing a mode of presentation of the object. Is that plain as day? Yeah. So you can see the 5 before you can access the colors. There's actually a famous case where Luria, the great neuropsychologist Luria, was in Uzbekistan, and an Uzbek peasant said to him, "Us Uzbeks don't understand the colors of things, and so we call everything blue." And what he was saying there was not, we can't see any color but blue, we're all colorblind. He wasn't saying that, he was just saying we can't use this color vocabulary. We don't have that kind of facility. So the color's got to be making a difference to your visual experience. In fact, the color is what's allowing you, is the mode of presentation of the object, but it's not a description that you understand. And in vision science, you can, there are whole sets of experiments about this, where you can define the relation between the subject and the display and ask, what in the display is the subject using to select the object? Here is access being defined. Access to the color. Actually, I'm not sure I have time to do this. You can define a distinction between using a property to select an object and using a property as something about the object that you're going to report, something you're going to use to describe the object. You can do that in terms of the relation between the subject and what's on the computer screen. You can do that at the high level. Yeah. So selection here is when you use the property to pull out the object. So if you were asked, let's see, what is the task here? If you were asked, report the shape of the red one, yeah, then selection here is, wait a minute. I'm sorry, yes, that's right. To report the shape of the red one, the selection here is easy because the red one is sharply different to the green ones. Yeah. Here it's harder because the red one is more like in color to the distractors. Yeah. Reporting the shape of the red one is harder here than here because you get two targets to report. And pulling out the red one and reporting is harder here. Pulling out the red one is harder here because the distractors are similarly colored, and reporting is harder because you get two to report. Okay? So that distinction between using a property to select an object and regarding a property of an object as something that you're going to use to describe the object, something you explicitly characterize it in terms of, you can describe that in, at the level of the relation between the subject and the environment. So there's two different aspects of your consciousness of the properties of objects around you. Yep. Color stupidity, yes. Sorry, say that again. Exactly, that's exactly right. So that with color stupidity, you're finding selection easy, but you can't do the access. Yeah. And that's kind of puzzling if you never made that distinction. Yeah. But once you make that distinction, it's very intuitive, I think. Okay. Any questions about that? That all plain as day? So you see how all these problems are being resolved as we head towards the last couple of classes? Yes? Okay, this is a diagram of what's going on at the neural level when you're selecting and accessing properties. So remember we talked about these Treisman-style feature maps? Yeah. This is a diagram of your brain, what's going on when you're looking at the 5. You use the color here to pull out the object, and then you report, that pulls out a location, and then to access it, you look down at what's in those, at that place in those same maps. Yeah. So there are 2 steps in ordinary vision to, say, reporting the color of a thing. You pull out the object by means of its color, and then you look again at that bit in your brain and report it. As is usual in scientific discussions of consciousness, these guys, Huang and Pashler, have consciousness as some mysterious bit of the process being thrown off. But remember, we don't need to think about it like that. So there are contexts where you can argue that your experience of an object O at a high level is causally made possible by experience of a property. Oops. And at the level of information processing in the brain, visual representation of the object is made possible by representation of a property that it has. But when that's going on, you can say that the mode of presentation of the object is characterized by the property. You're getting the sense of your way of referring to the object is characterized by the color, even though you may not be able to report the color. You may have no description involving the color. Okay, so we'll give out questions, study questions for the final later today, and then we'll sweep triumphantly on next week. Okay? Right, thank you guys.